Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the studio. I'm beginning to get used to putting out videos every Thursday, and you guys have been responding well to it as well, so let's keep it rolling. Today we tackle important landmarks, mainly the bony points visible on the surface of the body. But first, some B-roll, a new term I've learned from Peter McKinnon's YouTube channel. Then some news, and then the usual Patreon plug. The news is that the Patreon page has been updated. Now your contribution continues to be added to an account that you will be able to use to get discounts in my soon-to-be web store. I'll be selling small maquettes and fragments of sculptures in limited editions. I have a post detailing out the changes on my Patreon page. If you haven't heard of Patreon before, Patreon is a website where you can easily contribute to your favorite creators. You can also get something in return. On my Patreon page, you'll be able to learn sculpture from me as I give feedback on your work. So, if you'd like some personal feedback from me and improve as a sculptor, or just want to contribute and help me create, check it out. The link is in the description below. Okay, so on to the agenda of today. Important landmarks. Some of these were mentioned in last week's video, but this time I'll show you each and every one that I think is important. We'll talk about the beginning stages of sculpture, where it's important to relate all the landmarks to each other in order to set yourself up for success later down the line. So let's start with the landmark that I start with, and if you're used to the channel, this should come as no surprise, and that landmark is the ASIS. The ASIS means anterior superior iliac spine. So there's some anatomy jargon for you. Anterior means front, superior means higher, and the iliac spine is the pelvic crest. So the ASIS is the forward-facing highest part of the pelvic crest. Now, that's a lot to remember, but it's actually fairly easy. Here's a front view of the pelvis, and right at the end of this crest or spine sits the ASIS. On the human figure, it will often appear as two bumps on the skin. Now here's how it looks on my model, and as you can see, they are not really bumps on him, but you can see this dark shadow and this little angle break right in here, and that's where the ASIS is. Because the two ASIS points are on the pelvis, they will always sit 90 degrees across from each other, so if the pelvis is tilted, they will tilt as well. And so I use these 2 points to find the tilt of my pelvis and keep track of it. And the distance between these 2 points become my first and trusted measurement. Everything else will have to relate to this one measurement. I'll often refer to this width as the width of my pelvis, even though it's actually the width of the ASIS, so keep that in mind. If I mention width of the pelvis, it's probably going to be the width of the ASIS. Another interesting thing to note about this area is that there is a point right below the ASIS called the AIIS, right here. AIIS means anterior inferior iliac spine. So inferior meaning below, so below the superior, right? This is where the quadriceps or the front thigh muscle attach, so it's a great point to know of when you're blocking in your sculpture. The quadriceps never run directly to the ASIS, but to the AIIS below it. So keep that in mind. The pelvis is a solid bone that won't bend and change on us. It's the structure to which a lot of muscles attach. So it's very important that you make sure it has the feeling of being solid inside your clay sculpture. This brings us to our next important landmark, which is the pieces and the sacrum. The pieces is the posterior superior iliac spine, so essentially the other end of the iliac spine. Posterior means behind, not in front, so it's the back of the iliac spine. And you can see it right here. On the skin surface of the model, it tends to look like 2 dark shadow dots, pretty close together and right above the buttocks. Now, on some models they will not be so apparent, and they're not very apparent on my model, but if you pause the video here and take a very close look, what you'll be able to see is the actual outline of the iliac crest, the iliac spine, as it goes to the pieces. So so you can actually see the spine on my model, not just two dark shadow areas, which I think is pretty neat. It's not often you get something like that. You can draw from the aces to the pieces to figure out where the iliac crest likely is. Now, on some people this is going to be quite obvious, on some people it's going to be more obscure depending on how much they weigh and how muscular they are, and depending on the pose. From the side view you can, if you shift slightly back and forth, see how the relationship between the aces and the pieces is. Now, it's important to get this right to make sure that the front of your sculpture connects well to the back of your sculpture, and the angle of this connection depends somewhat on your pose and a little bit on your model. So, right in between the pieces sits the sacrum, and it tends to be a little bit more obvious than the pieces. This image is a bit flat because of the pose. His sacrum here is facing the light, and so a lot of details get washed out and disappear. The sacrum is mounted to the pelvis, and it moves in relationship to the tilt of the pelvis. So its angles need to be perpendicular to the tilt of the pelvis. If not, the pelvis will end up looking broken, which is a big problem. My Photoshop skills are not great, but here you can get an idea of its actual shape on the surface of the skin. It tends to look kinda like a diamond. However, this does vary from model to model. Now perhaps the bone itself is always the same, or perhaps at least it's probably pretty close to being the same on most people. I'm not really sure, but how it appears on the surface seems to vary quite a bit. Because the sacrum is a bone, I spend time drawing it on the surface of the figure to figure out where to put my clay. And I make sure that when doing this, that this drawing is a lot more architectural and mechanic rather than organic. I try to draw with straight lines and create rigid shapes that match on either side, that are symmetrical. And then the organic part happens when all the shapes gets softly modeled and the edges disappear or becomes a lot more subtle. But below it all, there is still this very symmetrical architectural bony structure. And I think this creates a great effect that is very, very realistic. From the side view, the aces and sacrum must work together. So shuffle back and forth, make sure that they are in the correct relationship with each other height-wise. The sacrum should be more or less in the center of the two aces points also. So this ensures that the front and the back view have the same center line, so that your pelvis is not different in the front and the back, which would be an issue. So keep this very, very close in mind. Above the sacrum, usually very, very visible, on most people anyway, is what we nickname or call the Greek columns. And they nestle neatly into the shape of the sacrum. Now they are muscles, not bones, but they're very useful to keep in mind as they appear as columns erecting the lower part of the back. And here on my sculpture here, there's a lot of organic information slathered on top, but the columns are still there underneath. And you can see me drawing them out here, highlighting them, showing them off. They should be symmetrical in width, and as you can probably see here, mine were not, and so I had to make some adjustments. Slathering organic information on top of symmetrical architectural block-in is something I do a lot, and I try to do it everywhere it makes sense to do so. Now that's a general tip for you. Try to get a symmetrical architectural block-in with organic information smeared over the top, leading to structure and variation. Okay, that was the pelvis. And it brings us to the ribcage, the next big bony mass. And keep in mind that we treat the pelvis as one big bony mass that needs to be solid and not bent or crooked in any way. And we do the same thing with the ribcage. Even though it's made up of individual ribs and stuff, they tend to not bend as much as we think and compress as much as we think. So we treat it as one solid. We'll start off the way I would start by talking about the next landmark I would try to locate in space, and that is the pit of the neck. The pit of the neck is important because it helps us balance the figure. We talked about this a lot in last week's video, so if you didn't see that, go check it out. There's a link in the top right corner. The only important thing regarding the pit of the neck in the beginning phase of a sculpture is to locate it well from front view and from side view. It dictates where your center line ends up, it dictates the balance of the figure, and we don't want to spend much time sculpting anything surrounding it in the beginning because we need the pit of the neck to stay quite flexible as we establish information closer to our one true measurement, the width of the two aces points. That's kind of where we want to focus our attention mostly. But we do want to place the pit of the neck and hopefully place it well. And it's good to do this early on to give ourselves an idea of the balance of the figure and also how the center line is going to work, and to make sure that our rib cage that we're going to end up constructing gets placed well on top of the pelvis. Flexible is the name of the game. Once we locate the pit of the neck, we can locate the C7. The C7 is a vertebra of the cervical spine, and it's an important landmark because on the surface of our model, it will be most likely visually apparent. Most likely, and it usually is very clear and see, and it's right here. On some people and in some poses, you'll be able to see 2 or perhaps even 3 bumps, and the C7 is the one that the trapezius or the neck muscles point to. The C7 is far away from where we want to direct most of our attention early on, but just like the pit of the neck, we can use it to find the figure's balance and check how our center line compares to our model. So I think it's very important to still find it. We can also find its relationship to the pit of the neck from the side view. We can also measure the distance between the pit of the neck and the C7 from side view. It's not always a very accurate measurement, but it can give us some idea as to the width of the neck and the width of the top of the rib cage. Those are perhaps the most important landmarks to find in order to orient your figure well. But I will show you a few more that are important as well. We'll start off with the bottom of the sternum. Most of you will know it probably as the solar plexus, I guess. It's important from the side view because it gives us the angle of the rib cage, and it gives us something to connect the contour of our belly to. So it gives us something to aim our contours to, essentially. As you can see, the sternum is visible at the top of the rib cage coming out from the pit of the neck, but soon it disappears behind the pectorals or chest muscle. Again, this depends on the pose and your model. It's easy to measure its length because it's a bone, and so it won't change in length, and it gives you another point to measure to and triangulate the pit of the neck, essentially allowing you to double check that the pit of the neck is placed correctly. Here you can see all the measurements I would use. Important to note that you have to measure these with regularity to ensure that the pit of the neck doesn't move. Because the spine can bend and flex in between the pelvis and the rib cage, these distances can change, so it's very important that you double check them. Your model might be very consistent and there might not be much difference from time to time that you measure, or he or she might not be very consistent. So it's definitely something to keep track of. On to perhaps the most important of the secondary tier of important landmarks, and that is the corners of the rib cage. These are important, but they're very hard because they often will be very difficult to see. Sometimes one will dive into the flesh and disappear completely, depending on the pose, so they're very, very tricky. What they can do for you, however, is locate the trajectory of the edge of the rib cage from sternum to the corner of the rib cage. The corner of the rib cage relates to the aces from the side view, and using both side views can tell you if the rib cage is facing a different direction than your pelvis. So, an example, if one corner is in front and the other behind the aces, this is a clue that the rib cage is twisting in relationship to the pelvis. The two corners should usually sit 90 degrees across from each other, perpendicular to the center line running through the rib cage, and they'll also very likely sit at the same depth in relationship to the twist of the rib cage. You can use the flat surface of the sternum as a reference point. Looking from below your sculpture up at it, looking up through the rib cage can really help you figure out how the rib cage twists. Later on in your sculpture, it can be very useful to find the distal ends of the clavicle. Distal meaning furthest point from the middle. Each clavicle or collarbone is the same length. The distance between them, however, can change as they move independently of each other. I've drawn them on here as straight lines, but you should look for an S shape or a subtle S shape from the front. And I think if you look, you'll probably find it. and from above they kind of look like bicycle handles. From above they make up this kind of diamond shape together with the shoulder blades. On my pose, one clavicle is obscured by the flesh of the shoulder as it's raised up, but it's still there underneath the flesh, and so hinting at it being there closer to the pit of the neck is very useful and gives the feeling of something of bone existing underneath the surface. The clavicle, together with the scapula, or shoulder blades, make up the shoulder girdle. Important to note that once you put the shoulder girdle in, moving the height of the pit of the neck and C7 becomes a lot more cumbersome and hard, so make sure both of those points are very well located before attempting to even put in the shoulder girdle. The scapula can be somewhat simplified into an L shape with lots of organic information inside of it. If you look closer, there is more than just a simple L shape, but L shape is usually a good place to start with it. Remember, both scapulas will be the same height, but they will move, they can be in different positions, independent from each other as they move independently. And from the side view, they have a very visible relationship to the bottom of the pectoral or chest muscle, which can help you locate them and place them well in relationship to the front. Because they move and rotate freely on top of the rib cage, they can be very, very tricky. Not only do they rotate on the back, they can also slide forward across the rib cage, which allows the arms to be extended forward. And this is gonna change the angle of the scapula. They are usually slightly angled forward as they lay on top of the rib cage, which curves from the back to side to front. This brings us to the last important landmark I'll talk about today, and that is the two ankle bony points. They probably have an anatomical name as well, but I sure don't know it, so we'll stick with ankle bony points. The inside ankle bony point is located slightly higher than the outside one, and I use them to balance my figure. Usually they will have a relationship with the pit of the neck. Here I use my plumb line to discover this, and we talked a lot about this last week, so you can check out the video from last week. Now, this video was very heavy with information, so perhaps it becomes a little bit difficult and much for someone, so if that's the case, then you can take a second look, pause whenever there's something confusing, and watch it again. If you begin by orienting all these important landmarks or bony points in relationship to each other, then I find that everything else falls into place in between them. Once you get good at this, it almost feels like you're kind of cheating. It makes the process so much easier, and if you work flexible and pay attention, it solves a lot of issues before you ever have to encounter them. Orient your important landmarks well in relationship to each other, and your sculpture is likely to improve. You will be less frustrated throughout the sculpting process, and I think your general well-being will improve as well. So give it a shot. Orient your important landmarks. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I encourage you to check out my Patreon page. I give feedback and critiques on people's work, and we talk about whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. There are several rewards, one of them being the maquette for this sculpture that you've been seeing me working on today. So check it out, the link is in the description below. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for a new video next Thursday. Subscribe and hit the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and share it with your friends and family. It helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.